Chapter 5 of Mr. Wicker's Widow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by May. Mr. Wicker's Window by Carley Dawson. Chapter 5. Well now, began Silly, that's a tale that not everyone knows, don't you see? And Mistress Becky would not care to be reminded of it, mark you, for reasons I shall shortly tell. His eyes, humorous as they were, took on a shrewdness under their sandy brows, as if judging the character of the boy before him and his ability to keep a secret. "First and foremost," he said, "you had best know who I am." He leaned back and hooked his thumbs under his armpits in a prideful gesture. "My lad," said Ned Cilley, thrusting out his chin, "I am a member of the Mirabelle's crew." "The Mirabelle!" Chris exclaimed. "Why, that's the ship in the bottle." "Aye," agreed Silly, nodding sagely. "The model of it's in the bottle right enough, since it's meself that made it the last trip home from the Chinese seas." "You made it yourself?" Chris breathed, looking aghast at the gnarled, knotted fingers, thick and roughened by work and weather, picturing to himself the delicacy of the miniature ship that lay so snugly in its transparent walls. "How in the world could you get it inside?" he asked. Ned wagged his head. "Ah, 'tis a trick and a tedious thing, no mistaking. But there's time and to spare for it, coming home from China." "China? You've been there? What's it like?" Chris wanted to know, his eyes eager. Silly smiled at him, a snaggle-toothed, friendly grin. "That's a tale for another time, my boy, for there's much telling there. You wanted the story of Becky's fine hat." "Yes, yes," urged Chris, "before she comes back." "Well now," began Silly, "bein' a member of the Mirabelle and all, means I see quite a bit of this port when we're home." He looked arch, as if Chris must know the reason for that. "And seein' as how Mistress Becky and me are fast friends, well, she's told me a thing or two that not everyone knows." He took a pull on the mug and wiped the froth from his lips. "It seems," he began, "that in her younger days Mistress Becky had one craving. She'd seen this hat that she now wears in a milliner's, and have it she must. Now," and the sailor leaned forward as the story held its own interest, "now a hat of that sort costs many a shilling, and Becky worked and saved for that bonnet for over a year." He eyed Chris again closely. "If you tell what I tell ye, Chris lad," Silly conjured him, "I shall get even with ye, I swear I will, for I would never want to hurt the feelin's of Becky Boozer, on my oath." "I'll not tell, sir, not to any one," Chris assured him. Ned Cilley seemed satisfied. "Well now," hunching closer with his chair, "it seems at long last she paid for that bonnet, and decided to wear it to the spectacle, that very afternoon." "The spectacle?" Chris questioned, his forehead wrinkled. "What's that?" "Ho, ho!" cackled Silly. "You are a country boy. Why, the spectacle, where the players are." "The theatre. What else?" "Oh," Chris said shortly, and thought of television and the movies, and held his tongue. He was beginning to try to fit himself into 2 centuries before his own time. "Yes," took up Silly. "So as I was saying, Mistress Boozer, bein' young and flighty in them days, and rightful proud of that bonnet she had took so long to earn, wore it to the spectacle, together with her best gown. Now as you seem not acquainted with the theatre, me lad, let me tell you that we give it here in any hall standing vacant, and out of doors in fair weather, and we set the benches in rows for those that pay for seats." He pulled out an evil-smelling clay pipe and stuffed it with tobacco, tamping it down with one grubby forefinger, and when it was well lit, pointed the stem at Chris by way of emphasis. "Mistress Becky gets herself a good place on this occasion, and sits herself down a tossin' of her feathers and her flowers, and as proud as a peacock, every inch of her. The people pack the benches, and the performance then begins. Rightly," and Silly jabbed the pipe stem at Chris, "rightly, only ladies of quality wear such hats as Becky wore, and should they go to the spectacle, which would be doubtful, for the crowd makes it no place for a gentlewoman, they would be sitting off apart, don't you see? But Becky sat spang in the centre of the hall, And you've seen the hat. 'Tis big enough for two and no mistake, and spreads along as well as up. Well, the time came to begin. Players came out on the stage, a-speaking of their parts and a-brandishing of their arms, as they do, when all at once a gentleman sitting behind Becky Boozer leaned forward and asked her, ever so politely, "Madam," says he, "please be so good as to remove your bonnet." Here Silly leaned forward, one hand on his stomach to facilitate a bow, aping as best he could the speech and manners of a gentleman. In a flash he resumed his own character and turned to Chris. "Well, did she take it off?" Ned demanded of Chris, frowning with concentration. 'Twas asked with rare politeness. Anyone would agree to that. He shook his head solemnly. "Why, no, Master Christopher, that she did not. Our Becky had just paid the final pence upon that hat, and after a year, 7 months, and 18 days, that hat was hers. She wanted all beholders to admire it. What cared she if the gentleman seated on the bench behind her saw more of her bonnet than of the play? In Becky Boozer's opinion, 'twas a more than fair exchange. So she tossed her head, did Becky, and denied not even a reply." Silly tossed his own sun-bleached thatch, and pursed up his mouth in imitation of Becky. Then, with another rapid change of grimace, he squinted up his eyes to signify the growing intensity of the situation, and leaned half-way across the table, shoved the dishes, pies, and pickles out of his way with his elbows. His deep voice sank to a husky whisper. So the performance went on, and never a glimpse of it did the poor gentleman see, seated as he was behind our Becky Boozer. So once more he bends forward and he speaks at her ear, urgent-like. Silly's eyebrows rose and fell with his agitation. So strong was the grip of the story upon him that it was evident that he fancied himself at the play, and could see the whole thing before him as plain as day. The poor gentleman says again, he took up, "Madam," he says, "I beg of you, please to be so kind. Nothing of the spectacle can I see. Please and be so good as to remove your hat." And would you believe it, my lad? No. Ned Silly shook his head from side to side. No, you would not. He leaned back, waving his hand as if to wipe away any lingering doubt in Chris's mind. Mistress Rebecca Boozer was that proud, he dropped his voice, that not for the world would she remove her bonnet. Dear me, no. She tossed her head again, feeling all them plumes a-tossin' too, and sat up straighter than before, and she a tall woman. Master Silly took a red bandana handkerchief from his coat-tail pocket and mopped his face. So excited and heated had he become at his own telling of the tale. Then once more he leaned forward confidentially. Well, little did she dream, our Becky Boozer, for when she tossed her head a second time and made no motion to remove her hat, the gentleman bent toward her, and, no doubt, his words were for her alone, and this is what he said. Ned Silly's blue eyes popped, and he cupped his hand by the side of his mouth so that his words could carry no further than the few inches dividing the boy and the man. He said, and so she told me, it did sound like a roar of thunder, though no one else did seem aware of it. "So then, Rebecca Boozer, wear your hat," the gentleman said. "The devil himself shall have no power to take it off'n you." "And do you know," whispered Silly in a low rumble, his eyes starting out of his head as were Chris's own, "'tis our belief it must have been the devil himself who sat behind her there, for from that very time Rebecca Boozer has been unable to remove that hat, neither by pushing, pulling, prying, steaming, cutting, tearing, nor by any method howsomever. The devil it was, the devil it must have been." Master Silly, exhausted by his recital, fell back in his chair, with just strength enough left to replenish his pewter mug from the jug of ale. Then, refreshed, he set the mug down, wiped his lips, and cocked an eye at Chris, who sat staring at him open-mouthed. "Try it yourself," he suggested, wagging his head. "I have. You'll not be able to heave it off, that I promise you. That hat is there for good and all. Mistress Boozer will doubtless be buried in that bonnet." He cocked his head the other way. "And what do you think of that?" Ned Silly inquired. After a long and thoughtful pause, Chris found his voice. "Master Silly," he said respectfully, does she sleep in it?" he asked. The picture of the elephantine Becky Boozer with a counterpane under her chin, and the hat with 24 red roses and 12 raving black plumes rising above the pillow, took hold of the sailor's fancy. He tipped back in his chair and laughed till he cried, and as he was coughing and spluttering, Mistress Boozer herself came rustling out of the passageway and across the kitchen to the table. "Be off with you, boy," she cried. "You and Silly, you're two of a kind that is plain to be seen." She looked from one to the other as Chris decided that it was a good thing for him that Becky likened him to the object of her doting, Master Silly. "Get along with you," she cried again, pulling Chris up out of his chair by his coat collar. "You are wanted by the master in his study, so look sharp. It's down the passage and to your right," Becky said, "and knock before you go in." Chris started off, but in the dusk of the passage he looked back in time to see Becky Boozer lost in tittering giggles and wild blushes as Master Silly, reaching up as high as his arm would go, chucked her under the chin. End of chapter 5.